Minefields were often a major obstacle for coming attacks. Both the Germans and Russians lacked minesweeping equipment, and losing your best soldiers by walking through mines wasn't considered the best option on both sides. So, what do? You send in the penal battalions to clear the mines. Not with equipment, but by letting punished soldiers walk over them. The whole idea of units consisting of condemned men wasn't invented in World War II. The history of these battalions goes back to the Napoleonic era. During the Napoleonic Wars, when a shortage of troops arose, Napoleon established the Régiment Pénal de l'Île-de-Ré. This regiment consisted of criminals and recalcitrant conscripts, soldiers who were resistant to their mandatory military service. By forming special units composed of criminals and troublesome soldiers and deploying them to the front lines, Napoleon conveyed the message that crime and rebellion were not ways to avoid military duty. The existence of these punitive units led to an increase in the number of soldiers and improved discipline throughout the French army. Hitler, a great admirer of Napoleon, read about these units and saw possibilities implementing this in his Wehrmacht. In 1935, the first Strafbattalion was raised, consisting of soldiers with a lack of discipline, and later on, also criminals and political adversaries of fascism. These men were given the opportunity of sentence reduction by serving in these penal battalions. At the start of the war, the Wehrmacht had 9 of these battalions. Under supervision of the military police, they fulfilled tasks such as supplying the front lines. Being regarded as untrustworthy, generals didn't see any frontline duties for these troops. Yet, this changed in December of 1941. The massive German invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, was losing steam. The Germans were halted right in front of Moscow and were introduced to the harsh Russian winter that destroyed Napoleon almost 130 years before. Casualties went into the hundreds of thousands, and German commander Fedor von Bock desperately asked for reinforcements. One of Hitler's solutions was to order the Strafbattalion to the front line and let them fulfill tasks that were, as quoted Hitler, under dangerous circumstances. He also declared that any offense made by a soldier should be dealt with as soon as possible, so that soldiers could be put to use in the field, instead of being in a prison cell. From April of 1942, about 40% of German soldiers who had to do time in a prison cell were integrated in penal battalions. They had to work together with regular army units, but most of the time had to conduct extremely dangerous missions. But they did them almost fearlessly. Word of these hardened special units soon reached Joseph Stalin, who was also desperately low on troops. Since the German invasion of 1941, the Russians lost hundreds of thousands of troops, killed, wounded, captured, but also because of deserting. Desertion levels were so high that Soviet High Command ordered the NKVD to set up a special barrier unit behind the front lines. The primary goal of these units was to make sure that no officers or soldiers were going to retreat during a battle without permission. They had the right to shoot and kill any possible deserters. In October of 1941, Lavrenti Beria, head of Soviet intelligence, reported that these units had prevented the desertion or retreat of 600,000 soldiers. Almost 25,000 had been arrested, of which 10,201 were sentenced to death. But that wasn't enough for Stalin. In the summer of 1942, the Germans launched Fall Blau, the drive into the oil-rich land of the Caucasus. Seeing his divisions getting battered by the Germans, Stalin issued his infamous order number 227, which stated, "It's time to stop retreating, not a step back," and he demanded that panic mongers and cowards be arrested on the spot. NKVD units were now charged with the assignment to arrest every soldier and officer who showed even the slightest reluctance to fight. The panic mongers could even be executed on the spot. But for the cowards, there was another way: the penal battalions, named in Russian the Strafbats. Stalin was impressed by the German penal battalions and wrote in his direct order, "The Germans have sent them to the most dangerous parts of the front and ordered them to pay for their sins with blood." Shortly after Order 227, a few thousand Russians were condemned to service in these new battalions. For young volunteering officers, these battalions seemed the perfect place to quickly rank up, because 1 month in a penal battalion counted as 6 months in a regular one. The first penal battalion that went on front duty consisted of 929 former officers, all stripped of their rank for violating Order 227. After 3 days of hopeless attacks, only 300 remained. The NKVD had little trouble filling the ranks of these battalions, for even the slightest of offenses put soldiers in a penal battalion. As a captain in the Red Army, experienced in person. As a war photographer, he took a picture of German POWs but made a mistake in the caption, on which the NKVD stripped him of his rank and sent him to a Strafbad. He would serve a year, enduring the horrors and massacres on the front line before being taken away because he got wounded. During the hard fights on the Eastern Front in 1943 and 1944, Hitler and Stalin kept on sending more and more troops to the penal battalions. The Red Army, for instance, had 25,000 penal soldiers, but a year later this number would grow to 178,000. On both sides, these units were seen as replaceable. Therefore, there was a continuous deficit of rations, munitions, and weapons. Penal units were equipped with obsolete weapons and often only given 10% of normal rations. And when there weren't enough weapons, the soldiers without one had to do with a simple bayonet. And to make sure the soldiers didn't flee during an attack, the NKVD positioned machine guns behind the starting line to shoot down any penal soldiers that abandoned the assault. The assaults were horrific. No artillery support, no tank support, and barely any weapons. But at least, they could see the enemy. That was not the case when the NKVD decided the penal soldiers could do a task the Spendables were made for, acting as a human minesweeper. Minefields often posed a problem during attacks, and that's why it was convenient for the generals to send less important soldiers forward the night before an assault to clear the mines. On the Russian side, it was also not uncommon to sacrifice Strafniki by sending them straight through a minefield at the beginning of an offensive. This way, they literally cleared the path for the regular troops in the Red Army. In 1944, 20-year-old Lieutenant Pilzin got the order from the NKVD to deploy his 8th Independent Penal Battalion as human minesweepers. General Pavel Batov, who was in charge of this part of the front, knew that the area was littered with mines. Therefore, he sent penal soldiers ahead. The intention was not for the troops to take the time to detect and dig up the mines. Instead, they were instructed to simply walk straight through the field so that any mines would be triggered by their body weight. And for the soldiers who lost their minds in anxiety or fear and fled during this, the NKVD stood ready with machine guns. Pilzin recalls, "We were sent into the field as cattle, as useless objects. Even though all our men were former officers with a lot of combat experience, this action single-handedly cost Pilzin 80% of his men." While the Russians sent the penal battalions to the front as cannon fodder, the Germans also had other plans with these men. Criminals also played a central role in the German punishment battalions. The most notorious among them was the Dirlewanger Brigade, named after its sadistic commander, SS Colonel Oskar Dirlewanger. Early in the war, the unit began as a 300-member battalion, primarily composed of convicted snipers whose shooting skills were put to use on the Eastern Front. However, by early 1944, the punishment battalion had grown into a brigade, and Dirlewanger was granted permission by SS leader Heinrich Himmler to select 800 men from antisocial and professional criminals. These criminals were added to the unit to expand its manpower, leading to a significant increase in the brigade's size and notoriety. At this point, also rapists, child molesters, murderers, and the mentally ill joined the infamous brigade. The actions of Dirlewanger's men were ruthless in their fight against Jews and partisans behind the front lines. In the Jewish ghetto of the Polish city of Lublin, the brigade's executioners reportedly forced multiple women to undress and then, while watching, poisoned them. These acts demonstrate the extreme cruelty and brutality that the Dirlewanger Brigade was known for during World War II. The unit was involved in numerous war crimes and atrocities, the most horrible one being the murder of 500 Polish children in a school during the Warsaw Uprising, making them one of the most infamous and dreaded formations in the German military. In 1944, with the Germans on the defense, the Russians were often confronted with well-positioned German defenses. To keep his momentum and speed, Stalin sacrificed the Strafniki to keep the offensive going. That year, no fewer than 14,000 soldiers from penal battalions died every month, making losses in these units 6 times higher than in the regular army. To fill up these ranks, the German army convicted former POWs, rescued from German POW camps, with treason, giving them a legitimate reason for sending them to the penal battalions. The suffering of the penal battalions went on till the last day of the Second World War in Europe. Both the Germans and Soviets sent thousands of men into their graves during the last few weeks of the war, during the Battle of Berlin, most of the time with no strategic or operational gain. Finally, in May of 1945, after Stalin declared the Great Victory, where Strafniki finally pardoned from duty. Approximately 50% of German soldiers in penal battalions died. Russian numbers were even higher. If you want to learn more untold stories during the Second World War, click here and make sure you subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out a lot.